campaigns, violation of civil liberties, harassment, and intimidation. Yet even as the CCP pursued this demolition of the rules-based order across economic, diplomatic, technological, and military domains over the past year, the reality of China's deep internal challenges became clearer. Economically, the old playbook for growth in China is faltering. China confronts an unsustainable debt burden and a deeply imbalanced economy. For 20 years, it relied on debt-fueled investment in real estate and infrastructure for growth. China's overall debt-to-GDP ratio has more than doubled since 2008, surpassing 300% in the first quarter of 2023 alone. China's banking sector struggles to deploy credit to support economic growth. China's people are unable to consume what it produces, and the economy is reliant upon exports for growth. Despite these political and economic challenges, the CCP remains structurally unwilling and unable to reform. The CCP has sought to channel investment into technology to become increasingly competitive and secure its hold on power. China's strengths in AI have the potential to be paradigm shifting, and the United States will need to effectively manage access to the components that develop AI, convert research innovation into appropriate commercial and military applications, and otherwise address U.S. technological dependencies on China's raw materials and manufacturing. The U.S. is not alone in confronting the challenges posed by the CCP. Over 2023, European governments came more clearly to see China as a systemic rival, owing in part to Beijing's support for Russia's unprovoked war in Ukraine. The Commission assesses potential for greater convergence between the United States and Europe on how to deter and constructively engage China, but key differences remain. Joint efforts could reduce the cost of policy implementation and allow for burden sharing. Deep collaboration is essential in limiting China's access to dual-use technologies, including advanced semiconductors, securing critical infrastructure like 5G networks from Chinese investment, and jointly formulating policy in emerging areas like AI and technical standard setting. Throughout 2023, China accelerated its political, military, economic, and information pressure against Taiwan, raising further concerns of potential military action. It increased its aggressive actions in the South China Sea, engaging in dangerous close encounters with U.S. and other military planes and ships exercising their rights of freedom of navigation. The CCP completed its transformation of Hong Kong from a once vibrant civil society to one of censorship and economic subjugation, destroying one of Hong Kong's advantages, its independent judiciary. We offer the recommendations in this year's report to provide Congress with tools to protect U.S. interests and values in this increasingly fraught moment. We look forward to briefing members and committees of Congress today and over the coming weeks. And with that, I'll now turn it over to Vice Chairman Wong.
Thank you, Carolyn. And I echo the chairwoman's comments about this team, about our expert witnesses, and really this whole effort on the report. And I want to highlight the care that went into the report and the spirit of public service behind its production. We are publishing this report on the eve of a meeting between the American president and the Chinese Communist Party's General Secretary. That meeting will no doubt be an important one, and it's the latest in a long series of senior-level meetings, diplomatic freezes and thaws, charm offensives, and wolf warrior Jeremiads we've seen in recent years. But observing the ups and downs in the U.S.-China relationship, the diplomatic relationship, is akin to watching the tidal cycles from the shore. They dominate our field of vision and are perhaps useful for navigating in the day-to-day, but ultimately, they don't tell you much about the character of the wider ocean. What our commission has attempted to do in this report is to look past the highs and the high and low tides of the relationship and dive deep into the deep ocean currents, the major strategic trends that are animating the U.S.-China competition. Our commission dove deeply into the state of China's economy. Chairwoman Bartholomew touched on China's increasing debt challenges, but there are additional structural problems. China is dealing with a soaring youth unemployment rate, above 21% as of June of this year. And that was before the Communist Party stopped publishing that number. Yet at the same time, China's regimented educational system is not producing the workforce it needs to advance its technological aims and move its economy up the value chain. In 2016, the Chinese government itself projected that 10 key industrial sectors will face a shortfall of nearly 30 million skilled workers by 2025, with huge workforce gaps in the areas of new generation information technology, power equipment and generation, and advanced material science. An underskilled workforce, high unemployment, and low consumption have put pressure on the Communist Party to fall back on old tools to juice economic growth, tools that are losing their effectiveness. And that casts a cloud over China's long-term competitiveness and social cohesion. China's structural economic challenges, however, have not dimmed the Communist Party's aggressive efforts to enhance its global influence. Today, in 2023, the United States and China are in an arms competition. In one respect, this competition is starting to look much like the nuclear arms race that dominated the second half of the 20th century, with China making investments towards seeking parity, but with a wider array of nuclear warheads and delivery systems on both sides. In another respect, both our nations are competing to evolve and modernize conventional forces. And in what might be the most challenging dimension of this race, the arms competition involves next-generation technology whose capabilities and battlefield applications are not yet fully understood. Our predecessors on this commission, over the last 20 years, have documented very well China's rapid military buildup. And I might pause to note that much of that research was conducted under Carolyn's leadership. Once a fast follower in the military and technological realms, China is now seeking to leapfrog the United States. If China seizes the lead in long-standing areas of U.S. advantage, especially in undersea warfare capabilities in space, or if it establishes a lead in artificial intelligence, the balance of power will change. That change would have global implications, with the most acute impacts felt across the Taiwan Strait, in the disputed areas of the South China Sea, and across the Indo-Pacific region. China's external push is not limited to military arms. Under the rule of General Secretary Xi, the Communist Party's overseas influence campaign has become more institutionalized, technologically sophisticated, and aggressive. The Communist Party bolsters its global image through propaganda, censorship, and disinformation. It manipulates local media and silences critical voices. Content sharing agreements and sponsored trainings between Chinese state media and foreign outlets are just some of the means by which it controls foreign coverage. Beijing also seeks to distort domestic policymaking to align the commercial interest of other countries with its strategic goals, including through outright corruption to enrich foreign elites. Congress and the administration are not unaware of these strategic trends. But what this commission has aimed to do in our report is to unpack the details of these trends, provide broader context, and formulate cogent and meaningful policy recommendations. This is a critical period. There is a broader realization, not just in Washington, D.C., and not just in the capitals of our friends and allies, but across the peoples of the free world, that the Chinese Communist Party represents a generational challenge to the international order. That broader realization provides the political space for prudent but bold policy changes that will enable the United States to navigate and ultimately steer these strategic currents, and do so to advance U.S. interests and ideals for the betterment of the world. Well, that's the end of our opening remarks. We now will move to a Q&A session. For those of you here live in the audience, if you could just raise your hand and someone will bring around a microphone to you. For those of you who are watching across the internet, if you want to go to our website, uscc.gov, you can fill out the Contact Us form, include your question, and it will be asked here in the room, and we can respond. Now, I do want to emphasize this is a question and answer period. It is not a platform for speeches and soliloquies. So I do respectfully ask that you keep your question brief and that you make sure it ends with a question mark. So let's, are we ready to move to the questions? Great, wonderful.
And I'll also note that our colleagues are all here with their expertise and available to answer questions too. Any questions from the audience?
Hi, thanks so much, Commissioners. Really appreciate it. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the things that maybe most trouble you about AI and what we've seen or what the Commission has seen in the past year with your research on how the CCP is deploying AI and whether or not the United States is postured to respond appropriately to that. Thank you so much.
I'm going to acknowledge Commissioner Hellberg for his expertise.
So when we talk about military AI, it's important to draw a distinction between specialized AI and general AI. A lot of people have described general AI as a new arms race, a new Manhattan Project. Some people have written op-eds comparing it to an Oppenheimer moment. But it's important to realize that today we're already seeing specialized AI deployed in the battlefield in the form of image recognition, target identification. So we're already seeing AI change results on the battlefield, and China has completely embraced AI as part of the modernization of its military. And I'm actually incredibly excited that the Commission is going to double down on technology issues, exploring more of these issues next year in some of the hearings that we're going to hold in the Q1 of next year.
Commissioner Shriver?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I think the one other thing I'd add is there's a lot of concern over AI being involved in the decision-making loop, particularly when it comes to strategic weapon systems. So this may even be a topic of discussion in San Francisco or perhaps Indonesia at the ADMM Plus. But there's a real concern that when it comes to strategic systems that we keep humans in the loop, particularly when it comes to the decisions related to the deployment of those systems. If it's an AI-generated decision, that's sort of a Dr. Strangelove type situation, which is not so fantastic to think about in this world.
And if I could actually just add one point that builds off of what my colleague just said, one of the fundamental incredibly important questions that governments, the US, Europe, and China are going to have to consider is that there's a real trade-off between the speed at which our militaries are going to be able to make decisions and actions and the degree to which we're going to allow AI to actually have control or have humans in the loop. So, trust, when we think about bilateral conversations between the US and China on basically regulating military AI is going to be incredibly important because there is a lot of evidence to believe that the Chinese are much more comfortable with basically delegating more of their decision-making process to AI algorithms, which basically means that the window that our military is going to have to respond to unfolding events in a conflict scenario is likely to shrink dramatically. And so that has implications for how we weigh the trade-off between, do we want to go really fast or do we want to keep humans in the loop because ethically it's probably the right thing to do.
Great, thanks. Additional questions?
I think we take a question from the virtual audience.
Okay.
Great. Our first question is from Bloomberg. Biden and Xi are set to meet tomorrow, and there are expectations of some announcements on fentanyl, potentially on military-to-military communications, and unlocking a commercial freeze on Boeing. How would you view these developments if they occur in the overall scope of the Commission's findings over the last year?
All right, I'll start, and I'm sure other people will have things to say. We have seen, for those of us who've been working on these issues for decades, that there's a lot of talk that takes place and agreements that are made, but enforcement mechanisms are a really important piece of all of this, and that's certainly what I will be looking towards. But when you look at things like fentanyl, when you look at the Chinese military, the dangerous military interactions that they are doing, there are very clear, concrete things that we will be able to see if progress is being made. If we know that precursors are not coming into this country for fentanyl, you can track it, right? I mean, you have a quantifiable way of determining if they are doing what they said they would do. Similarly, if we see what is a really needed reduction in dangerous interactions in the South China Sea, that is also something that is measurable and quantifiable. So for me, those are the kinds of things that I will be looking for. Colleagues, Alex?
Sure. You know, on the fentanyl piece, I just make a couple of observations. First of all, I want to draw everyone's attention to a wonderful research piece that our staff put out, I think a year or two ago, on the fentanyl trade, tracking the increase in the movement of precursors in recent years from China through third countries and ultimately into the United States and how that operates. I also want to highlight an additional observation that increase occurred in the post-pandemic period. Now, you will all remember that during this period, we saw a number of supply chains across commodities and finished goods out of China being very strained. Experienced a lot of delays. And I want to note that the only supply chain that was not only not strained, but it seemed to increase its efficiency and speed was the movement of fentanyl precursors out of China. So that's observation number one. Observation number two, when asked, the Chinese government will often say that they are unable to enforce the law, track the producers and shippers of these precursor materials. And that reminds me of when I used to talk to the Chinese about enforcement of North Korea's sanctions within their own borders, or cracking down on sanctions invasion. And they would say, we don't have as much power as you think. And I would always say, well, you have more power than you say. Particularly when we're talking about a government that strives very hard to enhance its ability to surveil and track and exert precise pressure on individuals throughout its 1.3, 1.4 billion person population. So they can do more on fentanyl. And my hope is that the discussions tomorrow and our continued pressure on the Chinese results in action, because it really is a major detriment to our society, health-wise, and our social fabric that needs more attention.
If I could just add one piece on the issue of fentanyl. Last year, in 2022, 110,000 Americans died from fentanyl overdoses in this country. It has ravaged and completely hollowed entire communities across this country. You're seeing it rightfully become an incredibly salient political issue in this current presidential election cycle. And when China says that it doesn't have the power to crack down on fentanyl, China has over 700 million security cameras on its streets with image recognition. You can't travel inside of China to visit family from one province to another without a government authorization. The idea that they don't have the power to crack down is frankly laughable. And they clearly have the power to disappear half of their billionaires and their government officials. So clearly, if they want to put an end to this fentanyl trade, they could probably do it overnight.
Just to echo what my colleagues have said, obviously being from West Virginia, this issue is of significant importance to me and my neighbors. West Virginia is not unique in the losses that it has suffered as part of the opioid and fentanyl crisis, but it has certainly suffered more than its fair share. I'm reminded of the construct that I think Secretary Blinken came up with regard to our broader relationship with China when he said, we want to cooperate where we can, compete where we should, and confront them where we must. We need their cooperation and the cooperation of their law enforcement agencies to help with these efforts. We're not going to rely on them exclusively, as we saw the Justice Department initiated criminal proceedings just last month against some of these manufacturers of fentanyl precursors. But they walked away from the table in the wake of Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last year, and it's imperative that they live up to their obligations to get back and cooperate on these global trafficking efforts.
Anybody else? No? All right, next question. Quiet group today.
Hello. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Just following along in the book on page 438 with regard to weapons technology and export controls, one of the recommendations is to expand CFIUS's ability to review investments, specifically in investments in the U.S. that could lead to the, I believe, the acquisition of, so it's investments in technology areas prioritized in the industrial policies of China, such as the 14th Five-Year Plan, Made in China 2025, and related initiatives. I was just curious if the Commission could please elaborate on what some of those areas might look like.
I'm going to turn this one over to Commissioner Wessel first, our resident expert on CFIUS.
Thank you, and I also want to echo the comments of the chair and the vice chair on our able-bodied and able-minded staff who help us through all of this. We have seen the FIRMA expansion back in 2018, but we still believe that there are gaps in terms of how CFIUS is looking and tracking across broad investment and threat vectors. And this recommendation is meant to go back to Made in China 2025, the various five-year plans, and make sure that we're tracking everything across those vectors. And it is, I'm sure you've seen these lists. They are identifiable, and we should have a clear effort to track those.
Anybody else? No, if not, I'm going to make a pitch for one other recommendation, which did not make it into our top 10, which is this commission has tried to be forward-leaning over the years in identifying issues that the Hill should be thinking about. One of our recommendations is that the Congress should hold hearings to evaluate the potential for establishing a single export licensing system. I know that creates a lot of cross-jurisdictional issues within congressional committees, but think that it would be an important step both for facilitating things for businesses that are trying to export, but also to make it easier to track so that the government knows what's being sold where and when, rather than having it across different agencies. So that's one of my own recommendations that I particularly hope that the Hill will take up.
Let me just be an amen chorus for the chair's comments just then. We've seen more extensive use of export controls over the last several years, most of it related to certain technologies, quantum, AI, et cetera, high-performance chips, but they are not coordinated across all domains, and there continue to be gaps. We just read this week about certain technology companies designing around certain limits, and again, that's capitalism, but it also poses potential threats to U.S. economic and security interests. And the unified approach the chair just talked about will allow greater conformity, greater coherence, and hopefully a more effective structure.
I think we have more virtual questions to go to.
Okay.
Another virtual question is, what areas would be the most important for the United States to cooperate with Europe on?
Alex, I'm going to turn that one over to you first.
Well, we appreciate that question, and it's an important one because cooperation and coordination and being closely aligned with our European allies, it will be real key in determining the course of the world in the coming decades. China has made a great attempt in recent years to balance the United States and Europe, but I think they've reached certain limits of that attempt given recent events in Ukraine and the invasion in Ukraine and China's support for Russia in that, as well as the continuing aftermath of COVID-19 across Europe. And I think that has forced a strategic realization among some of the leaders in Europe, as well as the broader populations. As far as the top area for coordination, I do want to draw your attention to one of our top recommendations in this year's report, which is Congress directing the administration and requiring regular updates of coordination with our European allies on economic sanctions planning in the case of any type of contingency in the Indo-Pacific involving China. This is necessary. Looking to the Ukraine example, we were able to implement the sanctions and economic pressure regime on Russia because there was a coordination beforehand between Europe and the United States on this. And there was an existing sanctions regime that rose out of the 2014 Russian invasion of the eastern parts of Ukraine. That made us ready. The same types of preparation have not occurred vis-a-vis China with our European allies. Now, I'm not going to say that there has been zero discussion of this type of planning, but what we can say is that whatever planning there is, it needs to be broader with a wider set of allies. It needs to be deeper. It needs to be more detailed. And perhaps it needs to be a bit more public, because the hope is that you never have to use those sanctions. The hope is that the prospect of that combined with our military power is a deterrent to any conflict with China.
Commissioner Wessel?
I agree with what the Vice Chair just said and add a couple of points, which is there is enhanced cooperation between the U.S. and the EU, and we have certain forums, the TTC and others that I think have enhanced those discussions. And we've seen on inbound and outbound investment screening, on export controls and certain other areas, greater coordination. But there are limits to that. And the question now, I think, is there somewhat of a pause in what the next steps are going forward. We were in Europe early this summer to have discussions across a number of capitals with leaders there, and de-risking is the major strategy that's being built into their planning. De-risking to some is addressing competitive challenges. De-risking to others is actually doubling down on investments in China. BASF and certain other European companies have looked at it that way. So a lot has been done, but much more needs to be done, and recognizing that we have shared interests and shared threat vectors that need to be addressed.
And I'd emphasize shared values also. Jacob?
Another shared interest that Europe and the United States share is both have been the recipient of a substantial amount of Chinese disinformation over the last few years. President Macron has complained that and has rightfully called out Russian and Chinese disinformation in France. We know that in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, there was a lot of disinformation circulating in Europe about the origins of COVID coming from US military bases in Italy. And so as our report this year recommends that Congress consider legislative restrictions on Chinese social media companies like TikTok, obviously there's significant potential for cross-transatlantic collaboration on fighting disinformation.
Commissioner Borokoff.
In our travels in the early spring to the EU and to speak with our like-minded potential allies in all of this de-risking, I wanted to emphasize that no one is anymore talking about total decoupling. No one has the intent to just completely cease economic cooperation in various areas with China. The whole idea of the de-risking is strictly aimed at the potential issues and challenges that might be related to strategic and critical technology and economic risk. So I came away, and I think we all did, somewhat heartened by the whole idea that the EU released in the early spring, just before we arrived, where their leadership talked about their plan for de-risking. And as Commissioner Wessel said, it means different things to different people. So we are recommending that everyone continue to work closely in advancing what is the exact right plan for that.
Thanks. Yes.
Hi, this is more into the financial sector, but thinking about the amount of debt that China owns, do you guys see them using that as a weapon moving forward in regards to unloading? We've seen them kind of accelerating unloading our treasuries and things at a higher clip, and with our bond markets maybe being a little more fragile. Do you see them using their debt burden or holding of our debt as a weapon in the future?
People have expressed concern about that, I'd say, going, back 20, 30 years. And I think the general consensus has been, where else are they going to put their money is really some of it. So I don't personally think that this is an issue that we should be fearful of taking steps that we think that the Chinese government might not be happy about, because we are concerned about them unloading a lot of debt. We didn't talk about that this year in our report, but Mike?
Let me just say that I agree with what the chair said, but I think the risk profile for China is a lot greater than it was 20 years ago with the bond issuances that have been fragile there. Fragile is putting it nicely, I think. And many of those are owned on global markets, not just restricted to Chinese investors. So I think they have a lot more to lose if there's any kind of utilization of debt as a weapon. I think the fragility of their system has been shown, and I think it's a lot greater than ours is.
I would echo what Commissioner Wessel just said, that as a long-term business owner all of my adult life, people tend to come to the table when they have financial issues that are real. It's one thing to perceive they're impending, but once they're real, almost any business, any government, anybody that has substantial economic issues typically will reach out and start becoming a little bit more reasonable when it comes to negotiating the future.
Thank you for taking my question. So could you give us a couple scenario of CCP's policy toward Taiwan after the election in January, based on the result of that election?
Well, I'm just going to preface by saying we don't know what the result of the election in January is going to be, so this would all be speculation. And I think I'm going to turn first to Commissioner Shriver on this one, who's one of our Taiwan experts.
Well, I think we have to take them at their word. They've talked about increasing pressure in the event of a DPP victory. In previous elections, in the lead up to the election, they've noted that they will give time and space for a newly elected president to formulate policies, articulate those policies, and they'll judge it on face value. This time they're saying, we already know DPP, we already know this candidate, we know what's in his heart, and so I think we can anticipate sort of a steady state of coercion and intimidation. Frankly, I think the likelihood of that under a KMT or TPP or some combination KMT TPP ticket, I think the general trend is towards more coercion and intimidation, no matter who's elected, because they're not looking for stability. They're not looking for sustainment of the status quo. They're looking to force unification, and whether that's through a government that they view as more likely to engage in talks and be more inclined at some form of reconciliation, or one that they view as more likely to push for political independence, separation. Either way, they're not going to forego the use of military tools to try to intimidate and coerce Taiwan. So I think what we've seen as sort of a new normal in their overreaction to Speaker Pelosi's visit, their overreaction to other engagements, I think a lot of that is sort of locked in and part of steady state now.
Commissioner Mann?
I do think that if there is I agree with Commissioner Shriver. I would say that if there is a change of government, meaning a change of party, that China will, based on past practice, will enter into a phase of show us that you're different. Show us how you're different. And I think, so I would expect in that sort of case that
emphasis would switch for at least for a few months from coercion to kind of psychological approaches to the new government.
Of course, between now and the election, we know that the Chinese government is intending to put a lot of pressure on the people of Taiwan through a number of different means, militarily, economically, diplomatically, misinformation, disinformation, because they are trying to control what the outcome is. So we'll see what happens with the vibrant democracy in Taiwan. Anybody else? If not, okay. Other questions?
You guys, thank you for having this hearing. It's been very, very informative. This is Max with Senator Bozeman's office, we're wondering what priorities should Congress take up, especially in concert with the administration and our allies in combating Belt and Road and building more goodwill towards the U.S. and the West as a whole.
I'll start with that. I think that it is incumbent, right, on all of us here in the U.S. working with our allies in ensuring that there is access to the kind of development assistance that the Belt and Road Initiative has been providing or saying that it's been providing. I think there's also going to be a lot of questions about the debt structure that has happened in a lot of these countries. A number of us who've worked on debt relief, international debt relief over the course of the past, again, 30 years, are quite concerned to see that China is doing what some would call irresponsible lending, figuring that, of course, we will end up, the U.S. taxpayer will end up having to bail out the Chinese lenders because of the concern about what's happening in these developing countries. I think there's a lot of resistance to that happening, but we know that we have some areas of expertise in development assistance that we need to be promoting more. We know that the Japanese have some, that, you know, all of our allies who are working together so that we get more bang for our buck, really, in terms of what it is. But it's been really clear over the course of the past year that the CCP is engaged in a number of activities in Belt and Road countries, but not just in Belt and Road countries, in Latin America, in Africa, elsewhere in Asia, and they're making inroads. So I think that we need to be fighting back in a number of different ways. To my mind, that also includes making sure that people in these countries have access to factual information through our international broadcasting efforts, training of journalists, training of academics, all of those kinds of things. We need to actively engage, I think, is the best answer I can give to that. Alex?
So it's important to keep track of Belt and Road, and it's Belt and Road as a concept or as a slogan is about 11 years old now. Enough time to see what the effects have been for a number of the investments and loans that the Chinese have made across the world. I want to note that in the recent Belt and Road conference, or whatever they call it, their confab, there was a lot of messaging from the Chinese contesting the idea that BRI is a debt trap. They even used the phrase saying, this is not a debt trap. And they had all these examples and propaganda saying that these countries were quite happy with the loans that they have taken on. But the numbers, I think, are quite clear. In our report, we talk about how the number of countries that are under debt distress in a short 5-year period has gone, or the percentage has gone from 10% to 60%. More than half of these loans are in distress for these countries, non-performing. That is a problem, a strategic problem for these countries, and a situation where these loans are a burden to these countries. Furthermore, we recommend in our recommendations that the U.S. Trade Development Association, USTDA, in conjunction with the Department of State and other agencies, begin issuing a biennial report tracking this situation as far as the burden on these developing countries, and work together with our European allies to respond. And I think one area for response is to place pressure on the Chinese to enter into the international framework, the Paris Club framework for debt relief. They refuse to do that. They want a free ride off of our allies and partners' efforts to work with these countries to relieve the debt, extend repayment plans, and work in a transparent fashion. There's a reason they do that. They're looking at BRI debt as leverage, and there are ways that they put pressure on these countries, again, to advance their own interests. We have to shed light on that and work together with our allies and partners to shed light and put pressure on the Chinese to work within the international system.
Yeah, and I would note there that there's rising questions in a number of the countries where BRI lending has been taking place about the quality of the projects that's being done. I think that in Nepal, just recently, both quality of projects and the corruption that might be facilitating those projects. There are some questions that have just come up in Nepal where they're going to investigate what has happened with the new international airport that was being financed by the Chinese government. So there's a lot of question and suspicion in these countries. One thing we have recommended in the past is that we use technical expertise so to make sure that the countries that are getting into these agreements understand all of the terms of the contracts and what they're signing up for, so that they then are not surprised by what is taking place. So again, it's a kind of a technical expertise that we can provide, that we should be providing in a number of different places where people are willing to accept it. Kim, did you have something you wanted to add?
I'd just like to add and agree, as we have been all morning, with each other's comments, but I think that's also an important component of this, which is, there are 12 commissioners, each of the 4 leaders gets 3 appointments. And this is, once again, a unanimous report this year, and that's not always easy. I think we've also seen in the House, for example, the Select Committee has been doing almost everything on a bipartisan basis, as has occurred in the Senate, et cetera. The ability to speak coherently in a durable way, to let friends, partners, allies know that our policy is going to be consistent going forward, always some slight aberrations, sends a very important message. When we were in Europe, the discussions were very different than ones we may have had 5, 6 years ago, where we all knew, whether it was Huawei or other things, there were big policy gaps. I think many countries around the world have seen the reality of China's policies in the Belt and Road and elsewhere. Many are paying the price of those policies, and the ability for us to speak with a bipartisan voice in a durable way is going to be more effective going forward than just about anything.
I have just a very quick question or comment regarding Belt and Road. It has slowed down a little, and without question, we don't know what's going to happen next, but I would submit to you that with the tremendous debt problems that are occurring internally on real estate in China today, there is an opportunity for our country to find a way to help those countries that are so deeply in debt, because it is clear that if China doesn't move quickly to correct their debt problems internally on homes and on real estate, it's going to be difficult for them to, in any way, support the current BRI agreements. And I would submit to you that they'll have their own internal, Belt and Home initiative, because the Belt and Road Initiative in other countries, those countries are having difficulty making payments. And I would like to take China at its word that they're not going to begin to do anything onerous to those countries, but they clearly aren't, unless something changes dramatically, they're not going to be able to do much more than they already have.
Any other questions?
Hello. What are the Commission's recommendations regarding how the U.S. should respond to China's recent push to increasingly denominate cross-border trade in yuan rather than dollars? Is there a significant risk of de-dollarization globally?
Who wants to take that one on? Commissioner Wessel?
There's certainly been a lot of efforts, but I don't think that we've seen that it's been having a major impact, and there's still, as with many commodities, et cetera, there's still dollar denominated. The amount of currency swaps, the amount of renminbi internationalization is still very low, and it doesn't appear that it is accelerated. But we've looked at it. Our staff has done reports, and it's something that's always on our agenda and forward-looking. But right now, I don't have the concerns. I don't think we have the concerns but it is something to monitor carefully.
Commissioner Mann?
I would just add that this is a case where anecdotes sometimes dominate. You can find some country that announces it's going to start yuan denomination, but overwhelmingly the general trend is not.
And we'll use there a quote from my former boss, Ms. Pelosi, who says the plural of anecdote is not data. So remember that as we assess all of this. Any other questions here in the audience? Anything online?
Another virtual question is, how is China seeking to undermine the rights of the Chinese diaspora, dissidents, and others residing in the United States, and what can Congress do to protect these individuals?
Commissioner Goodwin, can we turn to you on this one with the legal issues?
Sure. We did explore Chinese efforts to apply their laws extraterritorially and to intimidate, harass, and chill the speech and political efforts of dissidents and political opponents here in the United States and elsewhere abroad. More broadly, of course, here in the United States, the law is a great leveler, where anyone can walk into a courtroom against the government, against a powerful corporation or moneyed interest, or against a business competitor and be equal in the eyes of the law. To the Chinese Communist Party, the law is a tool. It's a tool to advance, secure, and protect their own strategic objectives, both domestically and around the globe. And what we've seen with their legal efforts is they want all the benefits and appearances of a modern legal system with none of the obligations. So no equality in the eyes of the law, no independence, which they view as, they denigrate as ill-advised Western thought. So in this one modest example, we've seen multiple instances of lawsuits being filed, meritless lawsuits being filed against Chinese dissidents and political opponents here in the United States, with the point being to impose cost. The cost is the point, the burden of defending expensive litigation, expensive discovery proceedings is the point. So what can we do? What some states have done is to enact anti-SLAPP statutes, or strategic lawsuits against public participation, to provide a mechanism up front to identify these lawsuits as politically motivated and meritless, to identify them as being filed by the party or on behalf of the party or another authoritarian regime by a proxy, and then to provide a mechanism whereby the court can undertake an expedited process to evaluate the merits, stay the proceedings, to halt the imposition of these burdens and costs on the front end, and see if the case can be dismissed.
This issue of reaching into the diaspora and trying to silence oppositional voices here in the U.S. and in countries around the world is of serious concern, I think. We see it happening on university campuses where Chinese students are shouting down pro-Tibetan groups, shouting down pro-Hong Kong, the Hong Kong diaspora now, given everything that's happening in Hong Kong, and it really goes against the whole concept of freedom of speech in this country. I am particularly concerned as we see this happening that other countries are now starting to take these activities on too, feeling like it's a long arm of Chinese censorship here in the United States that is now being done by India, by China, by Bangladesh, by other countries, and I think that it's a really unfortunate trend that's happening. So there are a number of things. We haven't really talked about Chinese students in higher education. There are a number of things that we have in our recommendation about what universities should be doing to make sure that Chinese students who come to study here feel free to express their own views and that they are not shutting down the views of people that they disagree with. That's one thing that's happening. And to protect the opposition, frankly, to protect the ability of people to speak out against their government even when they are actually not resident there. Jacob, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, one of the things that we also saw is China increasingly trying to censor political dissidents that are part of the diaspora here in the US and in other parts of the world like Canada through technological platforms. And this year's report actually highlights and recaps 2020 DOJ indictments where an executive at Zoom actually complied. China leveraged its censorship laws and its national intelligence laws in order to get an executive at Zoom to hand over information about Chinese dissidents discussing political topics deemed sensitive by the Chinese Communist Party. That dissident was not located in China, they were located in Canada. And so that's just one other example of how they're using their laws to silence dissidents abroad.
In our hearing on what is colloquially called lawfare that Commissioner Goodwin just referred to, we had some testimony about what tends to happen in states without anti-SLAPP rules, and this is one of the reasons that we've recommended considering a federal anti-SLAPP law. And the example that stuck in my mind so vividly was a small business person who spoke out against China, who was part of the China diaspora, and got sued. And the appeal judges in the states where they don't have anti-SLAPP laws say, well, if it's the law in China, I guess we're going to have to not throw this out of court, because they're not knowledgeable about laws in China, and we don't have laws in existence at the federal level that say some of those laws in that particular country aren't applicable to the laws here. So that's a very valid concern for someone that is simply being silenced. The idea is not any other than to tell the person, you need to stop talking poorly about our country, or we're going to sue you in America under our law that has no real basis of fact in our system.
The Chinese government has deep pockets to which to use for these suits, and of course the dissidents that they're going after do not.
Yeah, and just to kind of wrap up that particular recommendation, I think it's consistent with the shift that I think the Commission and other policymakers have begun talking about over the past couple of years, where instead of bemoaning the behavior or conduct of the Chinese Communist Party and asking ourselves, how can we change their conduct, what can we do to build resiliency against their market distorting practices, these efforts to undermine legal norms and institutions. And again, this is one modest example where we can hopefully inhibit their ability to impose costs on dissidents abroad.
Great. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. Talking about forced labor, how do you assess the implementation of the UFLPA? And what are your views on the de minimis rules?
I'm going to turn this one over to Commissioner Glass, who is our expert on these issues.
I think included in our report this year, at least in our research paper, since UFLPA has gone into effect, the production of items like Xinjiang cotton has actually increased. This cotton continues to bleed into our supply chains, both here in the United States and abroad, as in countries that also have a similar ban. We probably have the most progressive ban on these kinds of imports. And this is not just cotton, it's polysilicon, it's other products. UFLPA, CBP has a website where they advertise enforcement activities. But just to put it in context, last year we imported of textile and apparel goods $184 billion, and only 35 million was detained. So 20% of the world's cotton grown in Xinjiang, 80% of cotton-based apparel contains Xinjiang cotton. A lot of that cotton product is coming here to the United States. So one of the things our research paper did this year is look at Shein and Temu and the growing influence of these Chinese e-conglomerate online websites and their growing influence and the national security risks, the consumer security risks with these kinds of platforms, and the fact that the United States government, under our current trade policy, rewards these platforms when you are directly shipping a product here to the United States less than $800 to a particular consumer a day. And so our research paper talks about some of those products coming back testing positive for Xinjiang cotton. Again, this is not, the persecution of the Uyghurs is much broader than this particular supply chain, but our report and our analysis shows It raises some key questions. I think in the new year, we're going to be looking at these issues even more closely. And obviously, members on both sides of the aisle are talking about the issues associated with de minimis and the difficulties of enforcing the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
Commissioner Wessel?
Yeah, let me add to that, and I agree 100% with what the previous commissioner said, but we talked earlier about fentanyl as well, and the issue of de minimis and the number of packages that are coming into the U.S. With no inspection at all. Fentanyl is being transited that way as well. So de minimis is a vector not only for products emanating from the Xinjiang region, whether it's textiles or other products. I think there have been a number of studies across a number of supply chains, solar, aluminum, car parts, etc. But fentanyl is coming in through de minimis loophole. And the administration has the legal power to act. It does not necessarily have all the resources to inspect every single package. And when you look that CBP has, other authorities and other responsibilities, there needs to be something done. You raised de minimis, and I think that could be a much more effective tool across both, again, for the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, but other critical threats to U.S. interests.
Just to add to Mike's point and to crystallize it, de minimis was created 100 years ago when you were bringing back a sweater from abroad and not having to pay a tariff. But in the e-commerce platform in which we're living right now, de minimis packages to the United States have exploded. So in 2016, we had 150 million packages. Now we're well on track for 1 billion packages, individually wrapped boxes. You do not have to provide information on the country of origin, what's in the box, is it safe, does it meet our Consumer Product Safety Commission regulations, is it an illegal product, is it a forced labor product? None of that is ever labeled. No box says fentanyl, no box says forced labor product. And it's hard to administer for CBP to look at all these individual boxes. So what happens if the administration were to close the de minimis loophole tomorrow? A lot of this would go back to being transported on freight and part of a larger package of things to look at where it makes it easier for inspection, pulling certain items and seeing what's in the box and having the information needed. So this is a timely conversation given the illicit drugs that are coming through the system, and echo a lot of the commissioners who talked about the implications of fentanyl to families across our communities and how this stuff is getting into the U.S. marketplace.
Thanks. All right, maybe time for one more question.
So I saw in the report that you guys discussed a lot of the increasing economic and political cooperation between Russia and China following the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I was wondering if you envisioned any kind of particular scenarios or flashpoints that would lead to potential Chinese military aid to Russia, particularly following the news recently that North Korea is maybe providing military aid to Russia in the form of artillery ammunition.
Commissioner Shriver, let's start with you on that one.
Well, our report does document the types of support China is giving Russia, to include increasing support after the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. So it's a bigger story than just military assistance. I think what's important to point out is people are, including people in the administration, are trying to draw a line between lethality and non-lethal aid, and I understand that. But what our report documents is that there are things that are not kinetic necessarily, don't explode necessarily, but are in direct support of Russian military parts for Su-35 aircraft, radio jammers, mobile radars, we've drones that are certainly dual use, a number of things that have direct application for the battlefield. So I think there's sort of a diplomatic approach that is trying to make a distinction, but what we document in this report is a great deal of Chinese support to Russia that has only increased since the invasion, and that includes, purchase of more petroleum, doubling semiconductor exports to China, and these systems that have direct military application.
And we'll just add in there, yes, concerns about what North Korea is sending also to Russia, and what China's role in that might be, as well as transshipments through Hong Kong, for example. There's a lot of places where things are being sent that are facilitating Russia's attack on its war against Ukraine, and I think we all have to figure out ways to hold the Chinese more accountable to that too. Anybody else? If not, I want to thank our staff for all of the work that you've done. We've done it. It's done. Congratulations. Thank all of our colleagues. Thank you in the audience, and we look forward to continuing discussions with all of you. Thanks.